The flour had gathered in the cracks of the kitchen table, white against the dark maple, and Ruth was scraping it out with the dull edge of a butter knife. It was nearly midnight. The last lamp was burning low, and there were 6 loaves cooling beneath a cloth behind her. I remember the sound of that knife more clearly than I remember what I had said before it. A small, dry scraping, back and forth, back and forth. I had repeated something an elder once told me about a wife's duty, and Ruth did not answer for a long while. When she finally looked up, I saw that she was not angry. That would have been easier. She was tired in a way I had trained myself not to notice. My name is Malin. I am an Amish grandfather, and I have lived on the same stretch of land for most of my life. I have been a husband, a father, a deacon for a time, and now a grandfather, old enough to hear my own words coming back through the mouths of younger men. I tell these stories because age gives a man one advantage, if he is willing to use it. He can finally see the distance between what he was taught and what was true. As you listen, I would like to know something from you. Was there a sentence you heard so often in your family that you mistook it for wisdom? I was 24 when I first heard the words that shaped the next 40 years of my marriage. It was late October, after corn cutting, when the fields had gone the color of old rope. 4 married men were standing near the hitching rail after a church service. The horses breathed steam into the cold. Harness leather creaked whenever one of them shifted. I was newly married then, still proud of the word husband, still uncertain what the word required. One of the elders was a man I respected. His beard had gone silver at the chin. His farm was orderly. His sons worked hard. His daughters spoke softly. Nothing seemed out of place around him. To a young man, order can look very much like righteousness. He spoke about marriage in the plain, certain way older men sometimes do when they have forgotten how much they once did not know. A wife, he said, carried the duty of keeping peace in the home. She was to serve without keeping count, to yield before disagreement became division, and to protect her husband's standing by carrying private burdens quietly. He did not say these things harshly. That was part of their power. They were offered as settled truth, worn smooth by repetition. I took those words home like tools. At first I used them only in my thoughts. When Ruth rose before me to stir the stove, I thought that was her duty. When she packed food for the field and then worked beside me in the garden, I thought that was her duty. When our first child cried through 3 nights and Ruth's eyes became red around the edges, I noticed the crying more than I noticed her exhaustion. I had been taught that a good wife carried the peace of the home. I did not yet understand that I was handing her every weight and then admiring how quietly she bent beneath it. Ruth was not a timid woman. People who did not know her well sometimes believed she was because she spoke after thinking. She had strong hands, narrow wrists, and a way of pressing her lips together when she had measured a thing completely. She could judge the weather from the smell coming off the south field. She could stretch one chicken into meals for 3 days. She knew which child was lying before the child had finished the first sentence. But she had also been taught that endurance was a virtue, and so had I. The difficulty with a sentence about duty is that it can excuse a man from asking whether he is being fair. When I was 30, we had 4 children under 9. That spring, the rain did not stop. The lane became a ribbon of mud. Fence posts leaned. Seed sacks waited in the shed while the planting days disappeared one by one. I was worried about money and ashamed of being worried. Shame made me quiet. Quiet made me hard to live beside. Ruth kept the household moving. She washed clothes in water she had heated herself. She baked twice each week. She tended the youngest, corrected the older ones, helped transplant onions, carried meals to the barn, and sat beside my mother when fever kept her in bed. At night, when the children were asleep, Ruth mended shirts by lamplight while I read the newspaper or studied the farm ledger. I told myself my work was heavier because it was outside and visible. That is one of the lies men can believe for a lifetime. Visible labor receives witnesses. Invisible labor receives expectations. There were years when I thanked Ruth often. There were also years when thanks became a substitute for change. I would praise her bread while leaving her to knead it. I would tell visitors that no woman managed a household better while never asking what the managing cost her. Compliments can become another way of keeping a person in the place where they are useful to you. The elders had said a wife should serve without keeping count. I repeated that thought whenever Ruth seemed discouraged, not always aloud. Often a belief does its deepest work without being spoken. It decides what a man sees. It decides which complaints sound reasonable and which sound ungrateful. It decides who is allowed to be tired. By our 15th year of marriage, I had become known as a steady man. That was the word people used, steady. My fences were straight, my accounts were clean, my children behaved in meeting. I was not a man who drank, shouted, or disappeared from home. I believed those absences of wrongdoing made me a good husband. But goodness is not only the harm a man avoids, it is also the burden he notices and chooses to carry. I did not understand that yet. One winter, Ruth's father became ill. He lived 5 miles away, and the roads were packed hard with snow. Ruth went when she could, sometimes by sleigh, sometimes with a neighbor. She returned after dark, smelling of wood smoke and medicine. I remember that she would stand near the stove without removing her coat, as though her body had forgotten what came next. I was inconvenienced by her grief. That is difficult to admit even now. The meals were simpler. The children were louder. A basket of clean washing sat unfolded for 2 days. I did not forbid her from going to her father. I even told myself I was being patient. But every kindness I offered had a quiet condition attached to it, that the household should still feel the same to me. When it did not, I brought up duty. I said a home needed someone to hold it together. I said the children depended on her. I said worry could not be allowed to disturb every responsibility. All of it sounded reasonable when spoken one sentence at a time. Taken together, it meant that Ruth was expected to grieve without becoming less useful. Her father died before the thaw. At the funeral meal, Ruth moved between tables carrying coffee. I watched her refill cups for men who had spent the morning speaking about her father's kindness. Her own cup sat untouched near the kitchen window. I remember seeing it there, a thin skin forming on the surface, and still I did not tell her to sit down. A man can witness the truth and refuse to understand it. Years passed, our children grew. The oldest boys took on more field work. The girls helped Ruth in the house. I believe this brought balance, but often it only passed the same lesson to another generation. Sons learned that a meal appeared when work was done. Daughters learned that being needed was close to being loved. I did not say those words to them. A household teaches through repetition. There were good years, too. I do not want to make 40 years sound empty of tenderness. Ruth and I laughed. We walked the back field after supper in June. We sat beside each other at weddings and funerals. We held grandchildren while their mothers rested. We knew the sound of each other's steps in the hall. Marriage is seldom one simple thing. Love can be real while unfairness is also real. That is what makes unfairness so easy to preserve. I loved Ruth. I also benefited from beliefs that made her life smaller. Both were true. The night with the flower on the table came in our 40th year. Harvest had ended. 2 of our sons had families of their own. A granddaughter was staying with us because her mother had taken sick after childbirth. The baby woke often. Ruth was 63 and still rising in the dark when someone cried. That day she had baked, watched the baby, helped prepare food for a quilting, and carried a basket to a neighbor whose husband had broken his leg. I had spent the day repairing a wagon tongue with my youngest son. It was honest work. It was not the only work that mattered. After supper, I mentioned that a shirt had not been mended. I can still see it over the back of a chair, one cuff torn where it had caught on a nail. Ruth said she had not reached it, nothing sharp in her voice, just fact. I answered with the old teaching. A wife's duty was to keep the household from falling into disorder. A woman who served her family should not need to be reminded. Peace came when each person accepted the place given to them. The words had aged less than we had. Ruth kept scraping flour from the table. The lamp chimney had a dark crescent of soot near the top. Outside, the wind moved against the bare branches of the pear tree. I waited for her to agree, because agreement had become part of what I expected from her. Then she looked at me and said, "Mahalan, I have kept your peace so long that I no longer know where mine was put." That was the only sentence. She did not accuse me of 40 years. She did not list the nights, the meals, the funerals, the children, the illnesses, or the times she had swallowed an opinion because I had already named mine as the proper one. She did not need to. Her one sentence opened every room in our marriage at once. I wish I could tell you I changed the next morning. Old beliefs do not leave merely because they have been exposed. At first I defended myself in silence. I remembered every chore I had done, every bill I had paid, every winter I had worked through sickness. I compared burdens as though marriage were a court and I could win by presenting evidence. For several days I was unusually helpful, which is not the same as being changed. I carried water without being asked. I washed supper dishes badly. I folded towels into shapes Ruth later refolded. Beneath it, I was still waiting to be praised for entering work she had done without praise for decades. Change began when I stopped treating her sentence as a complaint and started treating it as a description. I looked at the household differently, not sentimentally, carefully. I noticed how often Ruth's hands moved while everyone else sat. I noticed that she listened to 3 conversations at once because someone would soon need an answer. I noticed that rest came to her only after she had prepared rest for others. I noticed how frequently I asked where something was instead of looking for it. I noticed that when family visited, I received the pleasure of their company while she received the responsibility of feeding it. These were not hidden things. I had hidden myself from them. The next difficult step was remembering how often I had passed the teaching onward. Younger husbands had asked me for counsel. I had told them that leadership required firmness. I had warned them against letting disagreement weaken the order of the home. I had praised patient wives and called demanding wives restless. Sometimes I had spoken gently. Wrong ideas do not become harmless because they are delivered in a calm voice. I began correcting myself where I could. I told my sons that a wife's silence was not proof of peace. I told them a clean house could conceal an exhausted woman. I told them that providing money or food did not purchase the right to be served in every other part of life. I told them that leadership, if the word was to mean anything decent, began with taking responsibility for the weight one had failed to see. Some listened, some looked uncomfortable. One reminded me that I had taught differently when he was young. He was right. Age does not excuse contradiction. Sometimes contradiction is the first evidence that a man has finally learned. Ruth did not become a different person after that night. She did not suddenly speak at length or demand an accounting. She remained measured. But I began asking questions I should have asked when we were newly married. What work had become too much? What did she do only because everyone assumed she would? What had she stopped enjoying because enjoyment required time she did not possess? What did peace mean to her? The answers came slowly. Some never came in words. I learned from the things she chose when there was room to choose. She liked sitting outside before breakfast in late spring. She liked piecing quilts when there was no deadline attached. She liked visiting her sister without calculating how many tasks would be waiting when she returned. She liked being asked rather than informed. These are small freedoms to anyone who has always had them. I also learned that helping was not enough if I still considered the household hers and my presence in it a favor. It was our home. The work belonged to both of us, even when tradition had divided the tasks. I could not bake as she did. She could not manage a team of young horses as I did. Fairness did not require sameness. It required that neither person's strength become the other person's excuse. There is another part of this story that matters. The elders who taught me were not monsters. Most had repeated what they had received. Their wives had repeated other teachings to young women. Whole communities can preserve a burden without any one person deciding to create it. That is why inherited ideas are so difficult to confront. They arrive wearing the faces of people we honor. But respect for the people who raised us does not require obedience to every mistake they handed down. For many years I feared that questioning one teaching would loosen every foundation beneath me. I thought certainty was the same as faithfulness. Now I believe faithfulness can require examination. A belief that produces patience only in the person with less power should be examined. A teaching that protects a husband's comfort more carefully than a wife's dignity should be examined. A peace maintained by one person's silence should be examined. I am not speaking against service. Marriage contains service every day. There were seasons when Ruth served me through illness. There were seasons when I served her. There were years when one of us could carry more than the other. The trouble begins when service is assigned as a permanent debt to one person and a voluntary virtue to the other. Duty without mutuality becomes ownership in respectable clothing. That sentence took me more than 60 years to understand. Ruth and I had years after the night at the kitchen table. Not enough years, though. A man always says that at the end. We became gentler with each other, more honest. I learned to prepare breakfast well enough that the grandchildren ate it without complaint. I learned which linens could be washed together and which could not. I learned that a floor did not announce when it needed sweeping. A person had to notice. More important, I learned to ask before deciding. When our youngest daughter faced a difficult choice, I asked Ruth what she thought before I gave my own opinion. When family gatherings were planned, I asked what size gathering she wanted rather than how many people the house could hold. When she was tired, I tried not to turn her tiredness into a problem she had to solve for me. I did not do these things perfectly. Old habits leave marks like wagon wheels in a wet lane. Even after the wagon is gone, the ruts guide the next set of wheels. A man must sometimes steer against them every day. After Ruth died, I found the old shirt with the torn cuff in a chest upstairs. She had mended it eventually. The stitches were small and even. I sat on the edge of the bed holding that cuff and thought of how many things she had repaired after I had called them her duty. I do not keep the shirt because of the cloth. I keep it because it refuses to let me make our story prettier than it was. We had love. We also had an imbalance I protected with respectable words. The lesson of 40 years is not that duty has no place in marriage. It is that duty must look in both directions. A husband has a duty to notice, to listen before the breaking point, to carry work without waiting to be managed, to protect his wife's dignity as carefully as he protects his own standing, to ask whether the peace in his home is shared or merely being maintained for him. A wife is not the keeper of a man's comfort. She is a whole person walking beside him. That is the observation I would leave with you. The teachings we inherit should be judged by the lives they produce, not only by the age of the voices repeating them. Some old words are strong beams, others are old locks. Wisdom is learning the difference before another generation grows up inside the same room. I cannot return to the young husband standing beside the hitching rail in October. I cannot stop him from taking those words home, but I can tell the truth now, while there are younger husbands listening and wives who have carried enough. If this story gave you something to think about, you are welcome to subscribe and sit with me again. I have lived long enough to know that the most important stories are often the ones we were once afraid to examine. And in the comments, tell me this: what teaching about marriage or family did you have to reconsider as you grew older?